Good morning, everyone. This is People of Substance by LemonSkies. I'm Olga, and I'm thrilled to have my guest today, Paul Yeghiayan. I practiced your last name before we got started. Hello.
Thank you, Olga. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for having me on.
So, Paul, you and I have never actually met in person. You're one of those LinkedIn connections, but I do feel like I know you because you're so thoughtful about philanthropy. Armenia, that's a topic we'll talk about. So I'm just thrilled to talk to you face to face. And you're currently at the Benefactor Group, but I was snooping around. You have pretty deep background on philanthropy from a number of Armenian nonprofits. You were at Heifer. So I'm just thrilled to have you. Please say hello.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. I've always been happy to be connected with you on LinkedIn. I do follow your posts. They are very optimistic and often quite sporting. So I'm usually involved in some kind of athletic activity. And I think you have great messaging around sort of work-life balance, which is always refreshing.
Thank you. Well, we're running a half marathon just on the trail in Vienna this weekend if you want to join us.
I can perhaps cheer you on.
You're like, only if I'm chased. Well, I want to just jump right in. And one of the questions that fascinates me is, how did you get into philanthropy, nonprofit sector? What has your journey been?
Sure. So I think that I've long had an interest in the nonprofit sector. My family was always involved with nonprofit activities, particularly on the international level. But sort of my very personal was kind of a sad story, but my best friend had contracted leukemia, and this was back in the late 90s. And we were both sort of in the hospitality sector with cafes, restaurants, bars, small hotels, that type of stuff. And we were able to rally, several thousand people for a blood drive with the Boston Red Cross. And turned out to be, like, I think, as of that date, the most successful single day blood drive that Boston had. And so it really showed me sort of the power of, bringing people together. I guess that's perhaps an early form of peer-to-peer fundraising. In this case, of course, it was more about blood than money. But and from there, I started getting involved in community access television. I got involved in a number of video productions around doing documentaries, just, a variety of stuff. And, eventually I just said, well, I can see a career here. And so I started going to school, back to graduate school, got my first job, basically, doing everything, recording gifts, asking for gifts, planning events. And then it's just sort of grown from a small NGO that I worked for to Heifer International, doing a lot of work, particularly in major gifts and public-private partnerships, working in public health, launching a public health foundation, and, so again, sort of a lot of public-private partnership, running a small university development team. And I've been on the consulting side for the last 6-7 years. So working with museums and hospitals and trade associations and social justice organizations, food banks. So yeah, I really love what I do.
Yeah. And you're not mentioning that, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the grad school you went to was Harvard University.
Yeah, well, I went to night school at Harvard, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just going to brag on your behalf. So the blood drives, we should talk about that separately. Innova in Fairfax here has a blood donation center. And, I'm actually due to go back. Well, I'm qualified any day now, but my best personal time was 8.5 minutes, I think, to fill a pint. I got competitive about, I was pretty proud of myself.
I can see. All right. I didn't know it was really a competition, but perhaps because there's usually at the end, there's a little bit of food. So maybe that's a bit of an enticement, who knows?
I'm more motivated by personal best than snacks. So
okay.
So let me ask you this: so you're more in the big, high touch philanthropic giving space. And my background is more in direct response, a lot of digital, a lot of those types of things. So I was actually dying to ask you is, what do you see as fundamentally different in working with donors in that space? And where do you see similarities in how we would interact to get a charitable donation of $50 versus a large philanthropic contribution?
Sure. So I think I'll say that there are people in the field that really don't like transactional fundraising. I'm not really among them. I think the transactional fundraising, the peer-to-peer direct response, has its place. I think that sometimes direct response can be overused, and that can engender some solicitation fatigue from some donors. I think that particularly peer-to-peer is really good, particularly for younger people to get involved in. I think it's a way for them to, without a lot of risk, sort of work with the network of people that they have and, raise funds for a project or an organization that they're really passionate about. I've seen it go well and not well on peer-to-peer. I think if an organization has the resources to support those donors and the sort of the journey that they're taking, that can be really good and can transition into them being a longer term donor. Many nonprofits don't do that particularly well. And so I think for some, peer-to-peer can be a bit of an unsatisfactory experience. I have done some work in direct response. I mean, Heifer International, for instance, has for decades been primarily funded through direct response. When I worked there, we were really building out their major giving team. And the transition is choppy. It's not, it's hard to go from direct response to, large scale giving. It can be done. And I think Heifer did a good job at it. Finding that right mix. What I think the one of the key differences is that I focus a lot of my attention on campaigns, capital campaigns or large initiatives, and typically these are very aspirational. So we're looking, in the millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. These are big scale projects. And they're often funded by a relatively small number of people. So you may be looking at a couple hundred people are funding 95% of a campaign, whether it's 10 million or 100 million or more. So that requires a very different strategy, very different interactions that you have with people when you're looking at 6, 7, 8+ figure gifts. These can take time, involves typically teams of leadership with executive directors, CEOs, boards, many of whom may be uncomfortable around the idea of asking for such large scale gifts. There's a lot of proof in what you're doing. The case that you develop for this has to be really, really on. And then of course the stewardship beyond that. When somebody makes a large gift, is like, what happens then?
Right.
So my interest has been more on the large scale gifts, primarily because, particularly with the international work that I've done, the challenges are large, and so the solutions need to be equally as large. I learned that really a lot when I was working at Heifer, and even some of the work in Armenia. Planting 100 trees is great. Planting 1 million trees is better. Or feeding 1 million is better than feeding 100, particularly if you can sustain it, particularly if you have well thought out on the ground programs working with the communities that are involved in the solutions. So that gets me more excited, if you will, than some of the other prospects out there.
There's a couple of things you said that really got me thinking. I mean, you're talking about peer-to-peer, and a friend of mine from college days started participating in a peer-to-peer campaign, and here we are, some years later, she continues to raise money for them, continues Wonderful. To do events. So over the years, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. But her first initial peer-to-peer venture was probably a couple $100 that she was able to raise. So don't discount those youngins.
For sure. And that's why I think to my point earlier, it can be very appropriate. it does tend to be overdone because the cost of entry is low. And so for a lot of organizations, they're looking for quick money, which is understandable. And then they become over-reliant on that as a mechanism. And then they don't take the time to build those relationships moving forward. And so it's like the only time that you hear from the organization is when they're asking you for money. And that's where the solicitation fatigue comes in, because they're not the only ones asking for money.
And there's no in-between kind of cultivation. It's sort of like, oh, it's time to register again. There's no sort of ongoing reminder of how impactful your efforts were, et cetera. And there's only so many times you want to hit up your friends. So
yeah, and often it's the nonprofit simply doesn't have the human resources to be able to do it, because the organization's not investing in building those relationships long term.
And there's the whole notion of charity versus philanthropy, right? So with larger gifts, you were talking about trees, it's a little different, but with hunger groups, is it solving for providing more meals, or is it addressing factors that are creating hunger in the first place?
Yeah, so I think that, definitions vary for sure. I think for my part, I think that charity, it tends to deal with more immediate sort of relief issues. So like if somebody lost their home because of a natural disaster, charity is needed. We need to give these people food, medical care, shelter, these things. I think that philanthropy is a bit more investment focused. So it's like, for instance, a lot of the work that we did at Heifer was about building agricultural value chains. So this is really working with the communities, often with like, women's self-help groups, setting up their own banks, doing things that they can sort of grow their own businesses, if you will. And so, those are longer term solutions, but yield, very positive results over the longer term. So I think charity is more immediate. Philanthropy tends to be a bit longer, in time.
It's more like teaching to fish versus
Sure.
Yeah, I love that. So, I think you've shared recently that the Gates Foundation committed to giving away a pretty significant amount of money in the coming year. We're seeing some of the work by Mackenzie Scott. What are other, capital P philanthropy trends are you seeing in the marketplace now?
Trends. Well, I think that what Mackenzie Scott is doing is a little different than Gates, and I think that she's being very thoughtful, and is getting a lot of good advice about sort of distributing large scale gifts to organizations that are on the ground that can deploy those resources relatively quickly, and she's doing so without a lot of strings attached, without a lot of restrictions, without a lot of excessive reporting, or like, just sort of onerous regulations and things that they're asking from these organizations, which is great. And I think it's a very positive move, and hopefully her actions will inspire others to do more of that. I think, Gates, in my experience, invest in very large scale projects, whether it's, vaccinations with polio or dealing with malaria. They're looking particularly a lot of large scale public health. I think that they, in my understanding, that they have improved how they work on the ground. I think sometimes these larger philanthropies can be very top down, that, we know better than you. As opposed to understanding that, often people on the ground, the communities that you're serving, may have perspectives or solutions of their own that may want to consider. I think there have certainly been missteps by Gates. I don't think that those were intentional. I think that anybody trying to do anything on a large scale is going to fumble occasionally. But there are some other trends that I think are not as encouraging. And things that nonprofits seem to be very aware of. And one is that we're seeing a shrinking pool of donors. So the last 20 years in the United States, there's 20 million fewer donors than there were. So that's concerning. And I think that mirrors a lot of sort of macroeconomic things that we're seeing, shrinking middle class. So we're seeing fewer people making gifts, often larger gifts. The demographic of people giving is getting older. I mean, the average age of a donor in the U.S. is 65.
Yeah.
So the donors are sort of aging out. Smaller group of them, and more of them are giving money to donor advised funds and private foundations, which means that there's a lag, if you will, in the time that it takes for those dollars to actually get deployed on the ground. And so I think those are challenges that nonprofits need to really think about, how they're going to address that. Like, why is someone giving to a donor advised fund as opposed to giving directly to your organization? And we have to really think about why that is. And it's not just like tax reasons. There are other things. I think that maybe donors are finding unsatisfactory giving experiences, and that's being reflected in how they're deploying their charitable dollars.
Well, and I imagine, if you want to do something positive and charitable, but you don't have a connection to a specific organization, I can imagine that being the way to go as well.
Sure. Or you may not have confidence that they can manage the gift that you give, or that they will be, prudent stewards of the resources, or, and I think that that's a problem. So like what Mackenzie Scott has done, and I think it's the Bridgespan group, I believe, has been providing a lot of philanthropy counsel. So they do extensive research into prospective organizations, and really, I'm sure, assess where those dollars can be best deployed. Organizations that can actually handle the gift. Now, that's not to say that all of them, have been able to handle it brilliantly. And I'm sure some have had challenges in understanding, if you're a $2 million a year organization and you get a $50 million unrestricted gift, and you don't have a very clear vision about what you would do with that, you're going to need to pause and really think carefully about how you're going to deploy those resources.
Interesting. So, Paul, in your other role, you wear many hats. So you do a lot of fundraising, but you're also this year's co-chair of the Bridge Conference. So I was wondering if you can talk about some of the big picture themes you're seeing, some of the things you're hoping to achieve.
Sure. Yeah. So I am the co-chair for the Bridge Integrated Marketing and Fundraising Conference. This is going to be the 18th year of the conference. It'll be happening at the Gaylord National Convention Center, which is in Maryland, just south of Washington, D.C. Last year, I was the education co-chair, and we had just over 2,000 attendees. Multiple education tracks, digital, different aspects of marketing, direct response, as we spoke about earlier, major gifts, planned giving, capital campaigns. This year, I'm thrilled that one of our education tracks is IDEA. This is inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. So we've had great submissions. We're also doing a little curating of a couple other presenters that we're hoping will join us. So it's about a 2.5-day conference. It's going to be August 2nd through the 4th this year. We're hoping to get about 2,500 people to attend. I think it's a great conference and works hard to do what I think should probably be easier, and that's the integration of marketing and fundraising, since I think they are so related. But I have found that they will often use the same language with very different meaning,
right.
And they have very different perspectives on how to approach things. But I think that integration is key to the long-term success of the fundraising sector.
I went to a storytelling session last year, and that was probably one of my favorites, just touching on ethics of storytelling. I just thought it was a very fresh, innovative way to look at things. So I thought that was wonderful.
Excellent. And I understand that you do a little bit of volunteering with Bridge as well. You're on the marketing committee, and so we certainly appreciate that. And much of my role, I should take a step back. So Bridge is a collaborative conference between the Association of Fundraising Professionals Washington, D.C. Metro chapter, of which I'm the president-elect, and then DMAW, which is the Direct Marketing Association of Washington. So this is a partnership between those two organizations. It's been a very good partnership, healthy, helps, I think, both our members and, we have speakers from all over the country coming in. So we're, very, very excited.
Great. Well, one other topic that I held off on, save the best for last here. One of the issues that you often post about and share information about is Armenia, which is some of your family background. I shared with you that I have a whole side of cousins and second and third cousins that lived in Armenia for a number of years.
Right.
So, I think when I read about this, and I have some familiarity with region's history, but, I'm struck by how little information there is about the area, what's happening there in the news. And I always appreciate being kept, that you seek those out and reshare that. So can you talk a little bit about that, what's happening and what people may not know?
Sure. So I think a little background is that people should be aware that there was a genocide in Armenia. This was back in 1915. It actually started decades before pogroms, large scale massacres. This was happening in what was then the Ottoman Empire. So, Armenians are indigenous to the area. They can trace their roots back, probably 5,000-6,000 years. Obviously, records get a little spotty, earlier than that. But in the First World War, part of Armenia, what would be known as Eastern Armenia, became part of the Soviet Union. And as is common in empire building, the rights and needs of indigenous people is at best a secondary concern. And so there was currently what's going on right now is there's an area in Azerbaijan known as Nagorno-Karabakh, or Armenians would refer to as Artsakh. So this is basically 99% Armenian. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, of Artsakh, wanted to either be independent of Azerbaijan or wanted to join Armenia. Azerbaijan was not thrilled by that idea, and it ensued with a war. This was back in 1992. About 30,000 people were killed. But Armenia was able, and the people of Artsakh were able to sort of secure Artsakh and some regions around it. For about 30 years, there was a stalemate. In the meantime, Azerbaijan, which is an autocratic, petrol-funded country, accumulated a lot of wealth and has built up a military, recently attacked Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia. There were thousands that were killed. What's going on right now is that Nagorno-Karabakh is isolated. There is a road that goes from Armenia to Nagorno-Karabakh called the Lachen Corridor. That road has been blocked, which means that all food, medicine, et cetera, has all been blocked. So what they're doing, this is classic ethnic cleansing. This is starve a population out. So about 120,000 people. So that's what's been going on. And of course, it's being, in part funded and supported by Turkey, whose earlier ancestors perpetrated the original genocide of Armenians. And it should be known that even the word genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin, who was an international attorney, and he was specifically referring to Armenia. And this is, race killing. That's what this is about. So that's what's going on right now. And I think there are reasons why it doesn't get a lot of press. One, I think, other than the oil interests in Azerbaijan, the U.S. has modest interest in the area. Russia has been a very strong influence on that area, obviously as a former Soviet state. But geographically, people can think, Armenia's landlocked. Their southern border is Iran. Their western border is Turkey. Their eastern border is Azerbaijan, and their northern border is Georgia. So they're in a challenging place. A small population, about 3 million. So yeah, that's what's going on.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I'm always struck by just how much is happening around the world, and just never makes the top headlines. So unless you really kind of seek it out, you just don't hear
Well,
about
yeah, I mean, but there's so many. I mean, you look at my family, when my family escaped the genocide, well, what was left of them, they went to Egypt and to
it. Mhm.
Ethiopia. And in Ethiopia right now, of course, the situation is terrible.
Mhm.
Through decades long droughts, there's civil war. There's, I mean, it's very, very bad, and we don't hear much about it. Or Yemen, we don't
Yeah.
hear that much. There are many areas in the world where there's a lot of conflict, and it just doesn't make the front page news. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that. Maybe they
Mhm.
just don't find it profitable.
Right.
Um, because we have so much for-profit news, it may just not be as profitable for
Yeah.
them, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. Well, Paul, thank you. I really always appreciate hearing from, I always try to read articles that you share.
Thank you.
So just really appreciate that. So, well, this was wonderful. I really enjoyed our time together. This was very personally insightful for me. So, the wheels are spinning, just the conversation about philanthropy. So I just really appreciate you taking the time.
Of course. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time as well.
Thank you for joining.